I'm going to name some things, and I want you to finish the sequence for me, okay? Eeny, meeny, miny. This bed's too hard. This bed's too soft. This bed is Larry, Curly, Laverne, and... So there's these things in our society, in our culture, in our language, they just sort of go together. You name one, you get the other. You can't name Laverne without Shirley. You name two, you get the third. You name three, you get the fourth. They just sort of come as a clump. Now, these things are also sort of culturally formed. So I've never been to Peru, but I'm guessing if I went to Peru and I said eeny, meeny, miny to somebody, they might think I have totally lost my mind. They may not know that to finish the sequence you say mo. If I went to some Indonesian island and I said Laverne, and they might not know to say Shirley because that's not part of their culture. It's not, they don't watch those television shows. They don't know. And in the opposite sense, people in Indonesia and Peru are going to have their own cultural clumps, their own cultural groupings that I'm not going to understand unless someone says, oh, well, yeah, this comes from a thing and they all go together. This is also true with the Bible. There are probably more than we're probably even aware of, these cultural things that because we didn't live 2,000 years ago, because we don't speak ancient Hebrew, that we're not always going to know. But every once in a while we can figure something out. And in this week's gospel lesson, probably one of the most famous parables out there, the parable of the Good Samaritan, there is one of these clumps, one of these groups that Jesus then ends up adding a twist onto, which probably got people quite upset. But if you don't remember the story, so Jesus is visited by a lawyer. This is not some corporate type lawyer. He's a religious lawyer. His life's work was memorizing and understanding the 613 laws of the Torah, and how you enacted those laws in your life. And so this lawyer comes to test Jesus. He's not so sure about this Jesus guy. He wants to sort of figure him out. And so he goes to him and he says, well, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, being a good teacher, says, well, what do you think? And so the lawyer goes, well, it names two commandments from the Old Testament, one from Deuteronomy, one from Leviticus. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. He puts the two together. And Jesus says, great, yeah, that's good. You answered it. Do that and you will live. You'll be good. But the lawyer came to test Jesus and he hasn't really gotten anything from him yet. He's been answering all the questions. So the lawyer has another question and he says, well, who's my neighbor? If I have to love my neighbor, who is my neighbor? Which is really a nice way of asking, who isn't my neighbor? Who don't I have to love? And to answer that, Jesus doesn't answer with a question. Jesus answers with a story, a parable. The parable of the Good Samaritan. As the parable goes, there's a guy who's on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, which, by the way, was this rather famous and harrowing journey. Jerusalem is several thousand feet above sea level. Jericho is about 1,000 feet below sea level. And so it was a steep road to get from one to the other. It was also built into the side of a mountain. So the road had one side went straight up the mountain, the other side went down a sheer cliff. So this guy's walking on the road, and he comes across a band of robbers. And he has nowhere to go because he's on the road to Jericho. And everyone knew you had nowhere to go. You can't go up, you can't go down. So the guy gets beaten up, stripped of everything he has, and the robbers leave him for dead. And then, of course, along comes a priest. And the priest sees him, and Luke tells us he passes by on the other side of the road, which probably means that he goes closer to the cliff drop-off. Like he was more comfortable going to the sheer drop-off than he was being near this guy. He goes on by. Next guy comes by is a Levite who is also a priest. although that's complicated, that would take another whole sermon, so I'm not going to do that. He's also a priest. He also passes by on the other side and goes on his way. Does not help the guy who's in need, naked, beaten up, half dead. So here's the Larry, Curly, Moe, the Laverne and Shirley, the eeny, meeny, miny, moe of this story. In Jesus' day, if you went up to your average Jew and you said, priest, Levite, everyone would know the answer to the third thing that finishes the group. It was always priest, Levite, and Israelite. Priest, Levite, Israelite. That was the grouping, like Laverne and Shirley. Like, this bed's too hard, this bed's too soft, this bed's just right. Priest, Levite, Israelite. We find it multiple times in the Old Testament. We find it a whole bunch of times in other ancient Jewish writings. Priest, Levite, Israelite. It was sort of a way of talking about the whole nation. And as Jesus is telling the story, everyone would have known after he talked about a priest and after he talked about the Levite that the next one's going to be the Israelite. And because stories are oftentimes told with like 3 elements, it's like a thing even to this day. The priest did the wrong thing. The Levite did the wrong thing. So the hero of the story, the one who is going to do the right thing, is obviously going to be the Israelite. Of course, and everyone listening to him was probably Israelites. So they're all like, we're going to be the hero of the story. We're going to do the right thing. What a great story, Jesus. And then Jesus says, Samaritan. And at this point, this is probably not too much of a stretch to say there would have been an audible gasp. Number one, because he's broken the pattern. Priest, Levite, Samaritan. It's like Larry, Curly, Osama bin Laden. Like it just does, they don't fit together. Not only did he break the pattern, but he also mentioned this group of people who were hated. Now, this parable is oftentimes interpreted today as, the Samaritans were this poor, oppressed minority. And so even this poor, oppressed minority was a neighbor to this guy. The Samaritans weren't a poor, oppressed minority, at least not at this point in history. If a Jew in Jesus' day heard the word Samaritan, they didn't think poor, oppressed minority. There are lots of stories in the Old Testament, the Torah, the New Testament, the Gospels, that are about taking care of poor, oppressed minorities. The thing is, this isn't one of them. Because Samaritans weren't the poor, oppressed minority. Samaritans were the enemies. They were religious enemies. They were cultural enemies. They were political enemies. They were military enemies. They had been enemies at this point for 1,000 years. There's 1,000 years of enmity and strife. Samaritans had done horrible things to the people of Jerusalem, and the people of Jerusalem had done horrible things to the Samaritans, just back and forth throughout the years. They are the enemy, as clear as day. There would have been people in Jesus' audience listening to him talk about, through this parable of the Good Samaritan, who would have said, well, I'd rather die in that ditch on the road to Jericho than be helped by some dirty Samaritan. Which, of course, is Jesus' point in telling this parable. The whole parable is about who is my neighbor, and Jesus' point is your enemy is your neighbor. The people you don't like are your neighbor. The people that you count as your enemy are your neighbor. People who count you as an enemy are your neighbor. And they are worthy of love. They are worthy of showing mercy to and receiving mercy from. We love them. Who is our neighbor? Them. Notice here in this parable, love is not a feeling. Okay, the Samaritan comes upon the guy who's laying on the road, and it's not like he just went, "Aw, poor fellow, I hope you feel better, and then keep going. No, he like does stuff. The two people may have hated each other. Jesus probably intends this to be a resident of Jerusalem, southern kingdom of Judah resident. The two people, they're enemies, but also neighbors. This parable would have been really hard for people in Jesus' day to hear. It's just as hard for us to hear today. I mean, think who would be the equivalent of Samaritan today? If Jesus were to come to us today and tell this parable, who would he include? Who would make us go, ugh? Who would make us think, I would rather die in a ditch than have this person, these people, take care of me? I tend to think this is probably one of the teachings that got Jesus in some trouble. This is probably one of the things that ended up getting Jesus crucified. Because we all know who our enemies are. And loving our enemies, showing mercy to our enemies, isn't the popular, politically expedient thing to do. But in the history of humanity, which is a history of retribution, one group, one tribe, one nation strikes another, and they strike back, and then they strike harder, and then they do it again, and then they go to war, and then war dies down, and then war picks back up again. I mean, in all of that history, have we gone anywhere? Like, have we solved it? Have we figured that out? Has it done any good? Has this like retribution after retribution done any good? I think the answer is no. And part of the message of this parable is the world doesn't have to be like this. Part of the message of this parable is the violence and retribution does not have to go on. The hatred does not have to go on. The cycle can be broken, and it can be broken by love. It can be broken by mercy. It can be broken by compassion. It's not going to be broken because we all of a sudden like the people. It's going to be broken because we don't care whether we like the people or not. We are going to love them. And who better to start this process of breaking this cycle than the people who are the followers of Jesus? Us, we who are called to love God with everything we are and everything we have, and love our neighbor as ourselves. Always, even when we know exactly who our neighbor is.